Come here, I'm trying to clear my debuff.
No, I'm trying to keep my damage buff from thundering, Dratnos. Do not clear. We still have 5 seconds left.
Oh no. Oh, now we're stunned. And now we're dead.
All right. Really cringy openings aside, there have been a couple of things that have been changing on the Dragonflight beta in regards to dungeons. There's a couple of different things, one of which being a thundering change that we're memeing about a little bit. In addition to that, as of time of recording this, no-code offensive Quarter Stars and Shadow Moon Burial Grounds will be available for testing as of the time that this video is at least released. It'll start being available for testing as of like 2 hours from when we're recording it. But the biggest thing that was alluded to in this blue post was there was going to be some thundering affix changes. And they didn't really specify exactly what that was going to mean, but they said that it was going to grant a much more powerful bonus to players. We now, after an hour later, have had this data mined on Wowhead. And now we can actually kind of dive in and understand what do these changes mean. You wanna take this one?
So first off, enemies have 5% more health in a Thundering Keystone. Doesn't really... That's not something you should think about too much. That's kind of just like a 5% health buff to M+. So if anything, that kind of moves M+ in general a little bit more towards you're dying because you are failing the timer versus dying because you're getting one-shot by mechanics. But on the other hand, the power of the affix is increased how much damage you do to 30% from 15%. So that kind of pushes back against that. So those two kind of neutralize out because you were getting more power now from thundering. But because we're getting more power from thundering, and they also slightly made it more punishing again to actually fail the thundering, that brought the stun back up to 5 seconds and increased the damage of the stun, which I think it was punishing enough at the 4-second stun, but this will make it like very bad again to fail this affix. But it is now probably worth playing around some more because, a 30% damage buff, that is worth going out of your way to preserve for extra time, right? Like that's a lot of extra DPS over the course of a keystone if you're averaging, say, 10 seconds versus 2 seconds of these marks on yourselves. So
when we were playtesting this on beta, a lot of the times there was never really any downside of like almost stacking up and instant clearing. And in a lot of situations, that was almost the preferred strategy because it was just easier to do the mechanics. And honestly, you wouldn't notice like a 15% damage buff unless you're like really diligently looking at like damage meters, looking at differences between runs in particular. Whereas with a 30% damage buff, you're going to make packs of trash noticeably easier if you're able to optimize and min-max like the 30% damage buff. And so, I mean, one of the main criticisms of just the Thundering Affix in general is that it didn't feel like it was... like the power that you were gaining from the Thundering Affix did not feel like it was incentivized enough. And I mean, you and I have talked about this a couple times. We talked about a couple of ways that they could change it potentially to incentivize play around it more. I mean, this is definitely one of them. 30% damage gain, you're going to be forced to kind of just min-max that buff. Do you think that this is like worse off for casuals, or do you think it's one of those situations where it's like you could probably still just like fully clear and even do upwards of like 15 and 20 level keys and not really see too much friction? Or do you think it's something that you should be forced to play around?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like 30%, like it's still not that bad to just insta clear.
Yeah.
Like it's not going to line up with cooldowns all that often, right? When it does, maybe the person who has their cooldowns, cheeses it a little bit and goes a little harder, but failing that, like you don't get to control when this is, it's still very punishing. Like, I don't know, is it worth going from, say, averaging 7 seconds to averaging 12 seconds of the buff if that means that, like, twice per dungeon you fail it and people die? Probably not, right? So I think that in a lot of groups it will still be best to clear pretty aggressively.
So how it procs right now is it's on a 60-second in-combat timer. So when players are in combat with mobs, every 60 seconds you proc it. And so it's actually near impossible to line up with any like amount of damage. They could potentially change it to be on like a 60 or 75 second global timer. I guess my initial reaction to something like that is a bit negative because I think that, I mean, we saw stuff with like Pride As, making sure that you had to have that shield proc at a very specific time to mitigate some damage whenever that was the thing. And so, or like you would have to wait until right as your thundering procs on a boss before you would pull the boss to make sure that you had it then line up later on. And so I think a global combat timer maybe isn't the best situation. In addition to that, it's kind of annoying if you're running around mounted inside of dungeons and whatnot. So I think the combat timer is the correct approach.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe it could be some kind of like, I don't know. I think it's probably the best way to have it going. But I agree that it like if there were ways to control it more or predict it more, maybe that would mean that it would be like more played around because you'd have it with your cooldowns more. But I don't even know if that's a good thing. So
Yeah,
I think it's fine.
I think that overall the changes. I'm really interested to see how it feels to play. I doubt it's realistically going to feel too much different. You're just going to be punished a little bit more now for clearing early. But I think that this is in an okay spot. I haven't had any major issues with thundering. I think that it's like an okay affix. I don't think it's like great or anything. I think it's generally just all right.
Yeah, I think it's for me. It's been an affix that like I'm not super excited about, but I'm also not like I'm not actively unhappy about it. So it's fine.
I think that's pretty fair. Okay,
Yeah.
A couple other stuff and topics that we have to hit. There have been changes in dungeon timers in Dragonflight. Specifically, no cut offensive. I mean, all of the Dragonflight dungeons initially got data mined at 30-minute timer, which I saw that, and we talked about this a couple times. Azure Vault initially launching at 30, I was very surprised. I did not think that was a 30-minute timer. No cut offensive showing up as the longest dungeon of the season at 40, which we haven't tested yet. Alcathar Academy getting bumped up to 32, kind of a little bit of a surprise for me, honestly, just with how kind of easy it is, I guess, on beta, but I don't think 32 is necessarily wrong. Halls of Valor getting chopped from 45 to 38, massive nerf to the timer there, and we're going to talk about why in a second. And then Shadow Moon Burial Grounds at 33, with Quarter Stars at 30 and Temple of the Jade Serpent at 35. I suspect that this is going to go down. Now, I don't have it on good authority that it's going to go down or anything, but this 35-minute timer is the CM bronze timer. And M+, very different than CM bronze timers, and so I don't think that this is going to be 35 minutes. I bet that this is going to be 30 at the most.
Yeah, it seems like 30 is like the target here. That like the fact that all the dungeons came out data mined at 30, I think that's like their ideal M+ dungeon now is 30 minutes is the idea. Which mine is too, so I hope that's true. The Halls of Valor change is definitely the biggest one, right? That's 7 minutes off the timer there.
Yes.
Halls of Valor was a dungeon that typically when completed, at least in Legion, it was like, I mean, the extra 7 minutes there, it gave you like a lot of wipe flexibility, but usually it was if you were beating that dungeon and you didn't have any deaths, you were beating it sub 38 minutes most of the time.
You had 7 minutes to spare.
Yeah, so I think this is fair, especially with how much they're like they're working on that dungeon and making sure that it's good. I do worry maybe it needs to go back up to like 40 or something to be not like a giga tight timer, but yeah.
There's a decent amount of stuff that like ends up inflating the timer in that dungeon, particularly like the amount of running you end up having to do in that dungeon and like RP time on both Odin and God King Skovald. So there is a decent amount of like timer inflation just due to those kind of things. So maybe it'll get bumped back up to 40, but I do think that at least moving the timer makes a lot of sense. And I think that I like that they're showing that. I mean, in general, we don't have anything that's like in the 45-minute range, which whenever Halls of Valor was initially like data mined as one of the dungeons for the season, people were like, wait, you're giving us a 45-minute key? We don't like these long dungeons, I think was the initial pushback. And so them being like, oh, no, this is actually not going to be a 45-minute dungeon. We've refurbished this enough to be a 38. And they're like, okay, this is fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like Halls of Valor used to be like a one-shot you dungeon, right? Whenever you started pushing, and now it's much less of that too. So yeah, I think the timer changes look good there. Obviously, got to test out some of those other ones. We also have Halls of Valor changes. Oh, God King Skovald nerfs.
Yeah.
Hello.
So Fellblaze Rush got nerfed again by another 17%, but now whenever the Fellblaze Rush hits you, it puts a dot on you. It also puts this targeting circle around you as opposed to this wild AoE effect that he used to have. So they reduce the splash radius to 4 yards was 10, which I'm sure for you as a tank, positive change. You're no longer going to accidentally kill your melee. The cast time being increased is also great. And I think that overall, the changes to God King Skovald, it turned it from a one-shot mechanic into now there's like some upfront damage, but there's a healable dot component, which I think is overall pretty solid.
Yeah, and you can still dodge the whole ability now. In fact, it's much easier to just dodge the whole ability if you're at range, right? By walking when he's running.
I mean,
like
Squishy dodges it in this video.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just, I think that is going to make that mechanic a lot easier to deal with, let's say.
Savage Blade also got nerfed. I think that was one of the biggest criticisms whenever we were doing, at least whenever I was seeing tanks do the dungeon. That's a dot from the Thunder Callers, right? That they apply to players.
Interesting. Is that the bleed?
Yeah, that's the bleed that would stack and would end up owning your tank.
No, that's a Skovald ability.
Oh, wait. Is this is this the Skovald?
It was just a Skovald active mitigation check.
Okay, well, they need to change the other Savage Blade.
So there are the bleeds from the mobs near the start of the dungeon. That was one of the most lethal parts in testing, but I think largely because they just kind of nerfed every other ability in that dungeon, and that one just didn't get touched because it wasn't a killer back in Legion or anything. But yeah, this lines up with what they did to a lot of bosses, because a lot of bosses in Legion had active mitigation abilities, and then whenever they like time walkinged them back the first time, they took those out from most of those, and I think that makes sense because they've kind of evolved from that being something that gets checked explicitly by bosses.
Another big thing, I mean, I was talking about the time whenever you were running post dungeon. Now, after killing the second boss, you get a buff. It's called Odin's Favor, and you get a 75% speed bonus whenever out of combat. So it'll help you get to the third boss a little bit quicker. So after you kill the third boss, you get like a massive speed bonus to be able to get all the way up to the God King Skovald area, get to the champions, and start the RP and do the mini bosses and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, you always got the buff after you killed the third boss. You got the same buff, right? Odin's Favor.
I think that this is a smaller buff. Maybe it isn't, though.
It seems like you just get it now after the second instead of the third.
Okay.
Typically you'd go Herja and then Fenrir, right? So this just means that the Herja to Fenrir run is a little quicker. And also it means it's like a little bit less bad to go Fenrir first because you get the speed buff on the way out, even if you didn't already kill Herja.
I mean, one of the big things, though, is that you used to be able to get the buff in combat, too. The speed buff.
Yeah. Did it apply in combat? Yeah, I guess it did.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
Interesting.
So, I mean, there's some changes. They've been modernizing this dungeon a lot. So not only these changes, there's actually been a decent number of undocumented changes in the dungeon. There have been some mobs that have been removed from packs. We know that trash count the amount of total count got increased in the dungeon, just as a whole. But in general, a lot of the mobs are giving a little bit more count. They also made mobs that didn't give count at all previously, like these mobs right here.
Yeah, those three. They
didn't give count at all, and now they give count. There's also just a decent number of mobs in general that have gotten easier. They've also changed a decent number of the bosses. I know that Heimdall, is Horn of Valor half as often. Herja, they removed some of the weird overlaps on Herja's abilities.
Yeah, there was just kind of blanket nerfs by like 75% of most of the killiest abilities in this dungeon, like 50 to 75%. So it is a very different experience to if you push keys in Legion. Like Halls of Valor, it feels like a modern dungeon now in that it is not about one-shotting you anymore. It is about getting through a dungeon of like medium difficulty effects in time.
So one of the big things, I actually really like this dungeon now. I think it's very interesting because there's a lot of pathing choices that you can make. So it's a linear dungeon in the sense of like you have to go through these very specific areas, but it's so wide that you're able to more often than not kind of pick the trash packs or trash pulls that you want to do to be able to specifically get 100% enemy forces count whenever you would like to. And so I think that the design decisions on Halls of Valor, I mean, I was really critical of like why this dungeon? Why did they pick this dungeon? I think I've kind of come around to it a little bit.
Yeah, I also like I didn't like it as a super long dungeon coming back, but I mean it isn't actually that long especially like a lot of the changes they just made in like 7.1 and 7.2 to this dungeon took out half the packs in the middle of the place. So yeah. I'm also reasonably optimistic about Halls of Valor now.
Anything else you want to say about this week's M+ changes? Tuning? Anything else?
No, I think that about covers it. Yeah, looking forward to seeing how. I guess probably by the time this video is out, we'll be able to see how Knockout Offensive is. That's the last Dragonflight Season 1 dungeon that hasn't yet been tested. So good to see that making its way into the pool. And then I'm curious to see if we're going to test the Dragonflight Season 2 dungeons now, or if they're just going to be like, we can save those until PTR.
I think it's a later me problem. So
Yeah.
I'm really interested to see like what they've done with Court of Stars and Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, because we haven't heard anything about either of those dungeons really. Like, what have they updated? I suspected they updated them in some capacity, right? Court of Stars with the profession stuff, surely something has changed. Yes, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we got to find out, but I'm not as surely as you.
Maybe not.
Sounds like some copium to me.
Yeah, maybe it's probably a bit of copium. Maybe they haven't changed anything about it. All right. Anyways, we'll be back next week's episode, and we hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Check down in the description for all of these links as well. So we'll see you guys later. Goodbye.